Hi, welcome back to part two of this memory section. Now, I want to continue talking about different models of memory organization. I briefly introduced the phonological model with the tip of the tongue idea, the idea that a word's neighborhood has a bunch of activation bouncing around it. We can also make models of memory organization based on semantic concepts. So semantic concepts refers to the meanings of words. So here we have on the right side of the screen a very simple snippet of a semantic lexical network. And this is a pretty basic network model. We have the word red here, kind of in the middle. And then we have semantic neighbors, so words that have similar meanings or are closely associated with the word red. Here we have different colors like orange, yellow, green. Over here we have fire engine, and then we have semantic concepts related to fire engine. So ambulance, bus, truck, car, street, vehicle. Here we have the word fire. We have apples, and then we have other fruit that are connected here in this semantic network, cherries and pears, roses, then we have other flowers, sunsets, sunrises, clouds. So you can kind of see how different semantic concepts are grouped together with these lines here. That means if there's a line between two words, that means they share a semantic association. So why am I bringing this up? Because I want to introduce the idea of spreading activation. When you activate one of these words, meaning when you think about one of these words, when you speak one of these words, or you hear one of these words, activation is going to strike whatever word it is that you were exposed to, and that activation is going to spread outwards across the network from the point where it originated. So if I show you the word red on a screen, that activation is going to activate the word red in your lexicon, but that activation is going to spread out across these links to closely associated concepts. So if I say the word red, the word apple might be slightly activated in your mind. If I say the word red, fire might be slightly activated in your mind, and so on and so forth. We have evidence for this idea of spreading activation from what we call priming studies. So in these priming studies, experimenters will have a participant simply respond to a word. They're usually given a word or a non-word. A non-word is simply a random string of letters that's not a real word. And they ask, is this a real word or a non-word? And let's say I give you the word wheel. You'll say that's a word. But then shortly after that, I give you the word bicycle. You're going to be slightly faster clicking yes, that bicycle is a real word, because wheel primed the word bicycle. So if I were to give you in another condition the word wheel, you say that's a word, and then I give you the word tree, you're going to be slightly slower than this first condition with bicycle, because wheel will prime bicycle much better than the word wheel will prime the word tree. Wheels and bicycles are very similar related semantic concepts, whereas wheels and trees, you can make a connection there, but it's a much weaker connection. So the spreading activation from the word wheel is going to reach the word bicycle much more powerfully, in a much quicker way than the activation from the word wheel is going to hit the word tree in your lexicon. So that's the idea of spreading activation. As you think about words or you're exposed to words throughout your day, activation is spreading across the lexical network. All right, so I want to leave that idea for now and talk about schemas. Now, a schema is a very broad term. It's a framework for mental information, a framework for information, almost like a stereotype. We have schemas for a person. So if you think about mother, you have a schema for what a mother is. It might be a very caring or nurturing person, might be someone who's middle aged. We typically don't think of mothers as very old or very young. They usually fit a specific age range. Maybe they have a kid by their side. Maybe they're actually holding a baby. Maybe they're feeding a baby. But we have a bunch of different things that we associate, different semantic constructs that we associate with this idea of a mother. We also have schemas for a profession. If someone says they're a professional athlete, that means certain things to us. We typically think of them as being very much in shape. We typically think of them as being very active, very healthy, um, different things of that sort. We have schemas for different groups. We have schemas for social interactions. So if you go to a restaurant and get a meal, you have a basic idea in your mind of how that interaction is going to go. You're going to walk in the front door of the restaurant, you're going to find a seat, you're going to order food, you're going to wait a little bit for that food, you're going to eat your food, and then you're going to pay for your food. And that's we kind of expect those things to happen anytime we engage in those schemas that we're familiar with. A schema, another way that we talk about this is a cognitive heuristic. This is a cognitive shortcut. It would be a little confusing. It would be a little draining if we had to relearn how to interact in a restaurant every single time we went into a restaurant. So instead, we have these schemas stored away. They're basically like scripts. We can rely on these scripts for how to interact in these different situations. So we have schemas for sex differences and racial differences. This is some pretty famous social psychology research from a researcher named Monica Burnett. She was actually at the University of Kansas while I was there. And she did these really interesting experiments where she showed participants pictures of men and pictures of women standing right behind little tick marks that showed exactly how tall those people were. And she made sure that the men and women that she was showing pictures of were the exact same height. So they were all 5'6". Then later on, she asked the participants who were shown the pictures who was taller. And almost every single time, the participants usually said that the men were taller. That simply wasn't true. They were all the same height, and they were explicitly shown in the images that they were the same height. So this shows that part of our schema for what a man is taller. Part of our schema for what a woman is shorter. She also went on to show some differences between races. So she showed pictures of white people, she showed pictures of black people, Hispanic people, Asian people. And then one of the questions she asked in that experiment was, who is the more athletic of the people that you were just shown a picture of? And people tended to say that the black people were the most athletic. So what does this show? Well, it shows that part of our schema for what a black person is might be a more athletic person. So I just bring up this research because I like the idea that schemas, we have all of this kind of baggage hanging around with our different ideas of what a man is, what a woman is, what a white person is, what a black person is. All of that information is just kind of hanging out in our minds attached to these different frameworks that we have. So, what happens if we're exposed to new information and we don't have a schema ready for that information? Well, this is a pretty famous memory experiment done back in the 70s. So, in this experiment, they gave people this description of a task listed on the screen here. And then they asked people to remember the order of operations in this task. So, I'll just read through this really quickly here. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future. But then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. So there was two conditions in the experiment. One condition was simply given this paragraph and asked to recall all the steps in order as best they could. The second condition was told, this is a description of how to do your laundry. And then they read through the paragraph, and then they were given the same recall task. Remember as many different tasks in order as you can. And the people who were told this is step-by-step instructions for how to do your laundry did much, much better on the memory test later on. So what does this tell us? This tells us if we have a schema to help us organize information, we're going to remember that information a lot better. And that's exactly what the results of the experiment found. All right, there we go. Oh boy, jumping all over the place here. Okay, so remember the video at the start of the first lecture? Well, let's see how well you remember it. What color was the jacket of the first man to enter the alley? What was the server who brought your coffee wearing? What type of car did the woman in heels get out of? What kind of truck drove by on the street? What did the second man running out of the alley look like? I'm sure, just like me, you are struggling pretty much to answer any of these questions. I think I could tell you the type of car that the woman in heels got out of. I think it was like a red kind of minivan looking thing. The server, oh, I don't know, maybe an apron. The color of the jacket, the first man to enter the alley, I want to say that was a black jacket. I don't know that for sure though. What kind of truck drove by on the street? I have no clue. I don't remember anything about a truck driving by on the street. And what did the second man running out of the alley look like? He had kind of a buzz cut. I want to say he had a white t-shirt on. But other than that, that's all I got. Here's the answers here. The first man to enter the alley did have a black jacket on. What was the server who brought you wearing your coffee wearing? A maroon button-up shirt and black pants. Got that one wrong. What type of car did the woman in heels get out of? A reddish hatchback. It's kind of accurate on that one. What kind of truck drove by on the street? There was no truck. What did the second man running out of the alley look like? Black t-shirt. I said white. Green pants, shaved head. So I got some of the details right, but I do this demo to highlight just how difficult it is to remember the events of a video or an event that you might have witnessed in real life. So we're going to talk a little bit about eyewitness testimony, and more broadly, we're going to talk about how memory is so valuable. We make memory mistakes all the time. Now, this little example of the eyewitness thing that you saw in that video, this happens all the time. People witness crimes on the street, and a certain amount of time passes before the cops show up, and they eventually try to take down eyewitness testimony. But you can imagine they ask you questions like this, and sometimes you might be accurate, but more often than not, you're probably going to be inaccurate in the information that you give in those eyewitness testimonies. And it's not through lack of trying. It's not that you're intentionally giving wrong information, but that's a really difficult thing to do, especially if you're not trying to remember the event as it happens. All right, so let's talk about some more ways that memory can screw up. So here's another demonstration. Remember all the words that you can. The words will flash on the screen one at a time. When finished with the presentation of words, write down as many words as you can recall. If you don't have pen and paper nearby, just try to think of them. Here we go. All right, so go ahead and try to think of as many words as you can from those words you were just exposed to. Did anyone catch the word hospital? How about the word health? Maybe doctor? Did you catch the word table, desk, or chair? If you said yes to doctor or chair, those words were actually not presented. Hospital, health, table, and desk were presented. Doctor and chair were not. This is an example, if you remembered those two words as being presented, this is an example of what we call a DRM false memory. DRM stands for Deese, Rodiger, and McDermott. Those are the three psychologists kind of famous for discovering this phenomenon. So what's going on here? So you were presented with close semantic associates of the word doctor and close semantic associates of the word chair. You had words like hospital, nurse, couch, seat, table. So those are words that are closely associated with chair, hospital, and nurse, closely associated with the word nurse or doctor. So we go back to our semantic network model here. And what we have is, again, this idea of spreading activation. So if I want to induce a false memory for the word red, I might present you with the words fire engine, fire, apples, cherries, sunsets, sunrises, roses, orange, green, yellow. But I never present the word red. And then later on a little memory test, you think the word red was presented, even though it wasn't. The only thing that was presented was its close semantic associates. So think about this. The fire engine is presented. Fire engine becomes activated in your lexicon. It spreads activation to the word red. Fire is activated. That activation spreads partially to red. Apples is presented. Apples becomes activated and spreads activation to the word red. So ping, 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 ping. The word red is never activated itself, but it's getting activation from all of its neighbors. So when you come to a memory test and you scan through your memory for words that have activation, the word red is probably going to have quite a bit of activation. So you might mistakenly say the word red was presented. So again, this is the DRM paradigm or DRM false memory. And it's just a really quick and easy example of how our memories are very much susceptible to mistakes. All right, we're going to skip that one and talk a little bit more about another huge name in the field of false memory research, and that is Elizabeth Loftus. Elizabeth Loftus is one of the groundbreaking names as far as how highly malleable and suggestible our memories can be. So Elizabeth Loftus came into the memory field at a time when there was this plague, I guess you could call it, of satanic cults. I think most of you in this class are probably too young to remember, but in the 80s and 90s, there was this idea that there's all these satanic cults in our country. They are performing satanic rituals, which might include blood sacrifices, child sacrifices, animal sacrifices, just these really crazy stuff going on. And you never know. It could be your neighbor next door that's doing these crazy things, but it's definitely happening. And so there was this rash of people who would go into therapy, and they would come out of therapy believing that they had been the victims, the childhood victims of some of these just bizarre satanic cult activities. Now, Elizabeth Loftus thought this was a little odd. So, this is kind of where she focused her research, that all these people have suffered these extremely traumatic events, but they have no memory of them until they go to therapy. So, she's really coming onto the scene when the idea of repressed memories is a very hot topic. And what Elizabeth Loftus found is that you can basically create a memory in someone simply by asking them questions. And she took a really deep dive into some of these therapy sessions, and she discovered that a lot of the therapists who were, quote unquote, helping victims retrieve repressed memories, they were giving these people, these patients, such leading questions that the therapists were actually creating memories of abuse. They were fabricating memories of abuse in these victims, these pseudo victims, I guess you could call them. So that's kind of where her research was focused when it first came on the scene. And she did a bunch of experiments just to show how easy it is to manipulate our memories. So she did some pretty cool experiments in the lab. She would show participants a video of a car crash, and she would ask different people different questions. So a question might be, how fast were the cars going when they smashed? And people would give an estimate of how fast they were going. She might ask a different group of participants, how fast were the cars going when they collided? And people would make an estimate. Yet another group would be asked, how fast were the cars going when they bumped? Another group, how fast were they going when they hit? Another group, how fast were they going when they contacted? So each of these words used in the different conditions has a slightly different semantic meaning. And lo and behold, people had different estimates for how fast those cars were going based on the last word of that sentence. And this is pretty much what her data looked like from this experiment. On the y-axis, we have the estimated speed. So this is what the people guessed that the speed of the cars when they contacted. And then on the x-axis, we have the different groups. So how fast were they going when they smashed, when they collided, when they bumped, when they hit, when they contacted. And you can see we've got a pretty noticeable decline in the estimate of the speed based on the last word of the sentence that was used. So when people were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed, on average they said just a little over 40 miles an hour. But all the way down here, how fast were the cars going when they contacted? That's a little hard to tell, but somewhere around 32, 33 miles an hour. A pretty steep drop simply based on a one word difference between the questions the participants were asked. So this is just a difference of one word, and we have this huge gap of almost 10 miles per hour on our speed estimates. So this is just an inconsequential, very kind of arbitrary experimental laboratory task. But just think about how easy it would be to influence memories outside of the laboratory when you can change way more than one word in your questions when you're trying to get people to retrieve memories. So Elizabeth Loftus went on to do some much more exciting and interesting experiments looking at false childhood memories. Because again, remember, she came onto the scene during this like satanic panic in the 80s and 90s, and people were having these crazy childhood memories of trauma. And she certainly wasn't saying that childhood trauma doesn't exist, but just it was almost like a pandemic. It was just happening in such huge volume that it made her a little suspicious that something else wasn't going on. So, what she did is she brought people into the laboratory and she kind of collaborated with their families. So, she contacted their families before they came into the laboratory and she asked for a couple examples of memories from their childhood. And she brought them into the laboratory and then asked them some details about those experiences. And they gave her the requested details. But then, importantly, she made up a childhood experience. And that made up childhood experience that she was asking about was either getting lost in the mall as a young child or taking a hot air balloon ride as a kid. So she'd bring people into the lab. She'd ask them about things that actually happened, maybe a trip to Disneyland or a trip to a cabin by the lake somewhere. And then she would ask him, and remember that time you were lost in the mall as a little kid? Can you tell me about that? And it was pretty surprising. People would fabricate huge, lengthy scenarios about what they did when they were lost in the mall. Like, oh, yeah, I remember that. I was crying. It was traumatic. I couldn't find my mom. I think we were Christmas shopping and we were at the Mall of America and oh, I was lost for hours. It was the worst day of my life. Even though this event never happened, simply by asking that one leading question. Hey, you were lost in the mall as a kid. Can you tell me about that? Elizabeth Loftus and her research team, they were able to induce these huge scenarios with very little effort. So yeah, once again, this is highly, highly applicable to the recovered memories of abuse that were sort of all the rage when Elizabeth Loftus first came on the scene. She's still around. She's still doing a lot of memory research, but this is where she first kind of gained notoriety. All right, we're gonna skip this slide and jump right to our last one here. So our memories are pretty easy to go wrong. They go wrong a lot of the time. They don't always act like a super accurate video replay of an event that happened in the past. Sometimes this is just because we don't have the ability to remember all the details, all the specific details, but other times this actually happens on purpose. And this is an adaptive bias. So again, we see that word adaptive. Remember, that word adaptive just means that there's some evolutionary advantage, there's some survival advantage. In this case, the advantage is happiness. If we can remember events in ways that are advantageous to our emotional state, that is a good thing. What am I talking about? So the first example on the slide there is rose-colored lenses. Maybe you've heard this term before. This is the idea that when we look back on past experiences, we might look at them through rose-colored lenses, meaning we only see the good things that happened in that particular event. We gloss over or we completely forget the bad things that happened in that event. This is very beneficial to our well-being. If we can forget about stressful things, if we can forget about things that maybe make us cringe emotionally or something like that, that is going to be very helpful to our current state of well-being. And we have a lot of evidence from some longitudinal studies where people have studied people's memory across the lifespan. So, for example, the Great Depression back in the 1930s, this was a pretty traumatic event to live through. There was extreme poverty all across the country, and it was pretty hard to put food on the table. for most people most of the time. But now, if you ask people